The inertia of expectation. As the winter of 1939 deepened, freezing the front lines in a sheath of ice and inactivity, the German Army High Command, Oberkommando des Heers, or OKH, under General Walther von Brauchitsch and his Chief of Staff, General Franz Halder, finalized their blueprint for the Western Offensive. The document, designated Fall Gelb, lies before me on the archival desk, its pages brittle with age. The plan was, in a word, uninspired. It called for the main German effort, Army Group B, to execute a powerful right hook through central Belgium and the Netherlands, mirroring a modified version of the infamous Schlieffen Plan of 1914. The objective was to seize the Channel coast, engage the cream of the Allied armies head-on, and win a conventional, if costly, victory. Halder, the quintessential general staff officer, meticulous, brilliant at logistics, but deeply conservative in his strategic thinking, saw this as the only professionally sound option. His planning was rooted in the grim arithmetic of attrition. The goal was not a spectacular annihilation of the enemy, but a limited victory that would secure Germany's western flank and perhaps force a negotiated peace. The entire operational concept was saturated with the lingering trauma of the First World War. The German General Staff, while priding itself on its professionalism, was still a prisoner of its own history. They anticipated a slow, grinding advance, with infantry securing ground methodically and tanks used as close support, tethered to the pace of the marching soldier. They expected the French and British to react predictably, advancing into Belgium to meet the German thrust, leading to a massive clash of arms, a battle of the Bulge on German terms. What they did not envision, and what their plan did not allow for, was a war of movement, of decision, of lightning-fast breakthroughs that rendered the entire concept of a front line obsolete. The initial Fall Gelb was a plan born of caution, a product of an institution that valued process over genius and feared risk more than it craved decisive victory. In the officers' messes of Army Group A, stationed further south, frustrated commanders looked at this plan with a sense of dread, seeing in its unimaginative lines the specter of another Verdun, another Somme, and another generation lost in the fields of Flanders. They understood that a war of attrition was a war Germany, with its limited resources compared to the combined British and French empires, could not afford to win. The stage was set not for a brilliant campaign, but for a bloody slogging match. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. The Genius of Koblenz. In a drafty office in Koblenz, the headquarters of Army Group A, Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein stared at the maps with a mixture of professional duty and intellectual contempt. As Chief of Staff to the aristocratic General Gerd von Rundstedt, Manstein was tasked with planning his army group's secondary role in Fall Gelb. His forces were to provide flank protection for the main push to the north, a thoroughly unglamorous and defensive assignment. But Manstein was not a man who accepted secondary roles, either for his army or his intellect. Born Fritz Erich George Eduard von Lewinsky and adopted into the aristocratic Manstein family, he was the personification of the Prussian military ideal, austere, demanding, supremely confident, and possessing a strategic mind of unparalleled clarity and audacity. He was, by all accounts, difficult. His arrogance was legendary, but it was an arrogance born of a profound and often proven conviction in his own superior abilities. Looking at the OKH's plan, he saw not a strategy for victory, but a blueprint for stalemate. He saw Germany committing its strongest forces to a head-on collision with the Allies' best troops, exactly where they were expected. Beginning in late October 1939, Manstein began to sketch out an alternative. His pen moved across the map, not along the well-trodden paths of 1914, but through a region marked on Allied maps with the word impenetrable, the Ardennes forest. The logic, as it formed in his mind, was breathtakingly simple yet profoundly revolutionary. Instead of attacking the enemy's strength, attack his weakness. The French considered the wooded, hilly terrain of the Ardennes impassable for a major armored force. Therefore, they defended it lightly, with second-rate reserve divisions. This, Manstein reasoned, was not a barrier but a gateway. He proposed a radical reversal of the German plan, make the secondary attack by Army Group A the main effort, the Schwerpunkt. A massive concentration of panzer divisions, a steel-tipped spearhead, would not just traverse the Ardennes but punch through it at speed, cross the Meuse River, and then, in a move that defied all military convention, race for the English Channel coast. It would not engage the Allied armies in Belgium but bypass them entirely, severing their supply lines and communications, and trapping them against the sea. He called this concept Sichelschnitt, the Sickle Cut. It was not a plan for a limited battle, it was a blueprint for the total annihilation of the enemy's field armies in a single, decisive stroke. The Panzer Prophet and his doctrine. Manstein's audacious strategic vision would have remained a theoretical exercise, a brilliant piece of staff work filed away and forgotten, had it not been for the existence of a man and a doctrine that could turn its radical geometry into battlefield reality. That man was General Heinz Guderian, the German army's foremost advocate for armored warfare. Guderian was to tactics what Manstein was to strategy, an evangelist, a firebrand, an insubordinate genius who had spent the better part of 2 decades fighting the conservative establishment. In his 1937 book, Achtung Panzer, he had laid out the very principles Manstein's plan now required. Guderian did not see the tank as an infantry support weapon, a mobile pillbox to help soldiers cross trenches. He envisioned it as the heart of a revolutionary new type of formation, the Panzer Division. This was a self-contained, combined arms team of tanks, motorized infantry, panzer grenadiers, mobile artillery, combat engineers, and signals units, all capable of moving at the same rapid pace. Crucially, Guderian's doctrine emphasized Klotzen, nicht kleckern, boot M, don't spatter M, or, more elegantly, strike with concentration, not dispersal. He argued for massing tanks at a single decisive point, the Schwerpunkt, to achieve a breakthrough, and then, most importantly, to exploit that breakthrough with relentless, deep penetrations into the enemy's rear, targeting his command and control centers and supply depots. This was the core concept of what the world would come to know as Blitzkrieg. The technological tools for this were now available. While the German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks of 1940 were not individually superior to the best French tanks like the Char B1 bis or the Somme S-35 in terms of armor or firepower, they possessed a critical, decisive advantage. Every single one was equipped with a radio. French doctrine placed the tank commander in the turret, where he had to load the gun, aim it, fire it, and command the tank, often communicating with other tanks via signal flags. The German system, with a dedicated commander, gunner, and loader, and universal radio communication, allowed for a level of tactical flexibility and coordinated command and control that the French simply could not match. Manstein's grand strategic sickle needed a razor-sharp edge, and Guderian's Panzer doctrine, with its emphasis on speed, communication, and independent action, was that edge. The walls of orthodoxy. With his plan refined, Manstein, through his superior Rundstedt, submitted the first memorandum outlining the Sichelschnitt concept to the OKH on October 31, 1939. The response from Berlin was a resounding silence, followed by polite but firm rejection. General Halder, in his meticulously kept diary, a priceless but notoriously self-serving archival source, barely acknowledged the proposal. He and his superior, Brauchitsch, viewed Manstein's plan with deep suspicion. To them, it was not genius, it was reckless gambling. Their professional training recoiled from the idea of sending the army's precious panzer divisions on a wild, unescorted dash deep into enemy territory. What if they were cut off and destroyed? What about their flanks? Where were the infantry to consolidate the gains? The entire concept violated the sacred principle of the concerted battle, where all arms moved together in a controlled and methodical manner. Halder's notations from the period reveal a mind obsessed with timetables and railway capacities, not with the psychological paralysis of an enemy. He dismissed the Ardennes thrust as a logistical nightmare and a tactical fantasy. Over the next 2 months, Manstein became a man obsessed. He submitted 6 more memoranda, each one more detailed and more insistent than the last, arguing, pleading, and demanding that his plan be given serious consideration. He was met with bureaucratic stonewalling. The OKH viewed him as a troublesome subordinate, an arrogant upstart who didn't understand the big picture. The professional jealousy was palpable. Halder, the master of the general staff system, could not abide being lectured by a field commander, however brilliant. To shut him up, in late January 1940, Halder engineered Manstein's promotion away from the front. He was to be given command of the newly formed XXXVII Infantry Corps, a backwater assignment that would effectively remove him from the strategic planning process. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver, silencing a dissenting voice by kicking it upstairs and out of the way. As far as Halder was concerned, the case was closed. The uninspired, orthodox Fall Gelb would proceed as planned. The Sickle Cut was dead, buried under the weight of institutional dogma. Manstein was to be exiled, his brilliant idea destined for the dustbin of history. A fateful error in the winter sky. History, however, possesses a profound sense of irony. Just as Manstein's voice was being silenced, fate intervened in the most dramatic and unexpected way. On January 10, 1940, a Messerschmitt Bf-108 Typhoon liaison aircraft took off from an airfield near Münster, heading for Cologne. On board was Major Helmuth Rheinberger, a Luftwaffe staff officer. Tucked inside his briefcase was a complete set of the most current plans for the orthodox Fall Gelb, the northern offensive through Belgium. The pilot, Major Erich von Manstein, became disoriented in the low-lying haze and, having lost his way, strayed across the border into neutral Belgium. Compounding the error, the aircraft's engine sputtered and died due to icing in the fuel line. Von Manstein was forced to make an emergency landing in a field near Vught, in what is now the Belgian province of Limburg. The crash became known as the Mechelin incident. Realizing the catastrophic nature of their predicament, Rheinberger desperately tried to burn the secret documents. He first tried his cigarette lighter, which failed. He then borrowed a box of matches from a Belgian farmer who had arrived at the scene, but the Belgian military police arrived before he could fully destroy the papers. The charred, but largely legible, remains of Germany's entire invasion strategy were seized. The Belgians, though officially neutral, quickly shared the intelligence with the French and British. The jig was up. The original plan was hopelessly compromised. In Berlin, the news was met with fury and panic. Hitler flew into one of his legendary rages, sacking the responsible Luftwaffe commanders. The OKH was thrown into turmoil, their carefully laid plans now worthless. This single, almost comical, blunder, a lost pilot, a frozen fuel line, a faulty lighter, did what Manstein's 7 memoranda could not. It shattered the intellectual foundations of the old plan and forced the German High Command, however reluctantly, to seek an alternative. The accidental crash in a Belgian field had created a strategic vacuum. Into this vacuum, the ghost of the Sickle Cut plan would now rush, resurrected by chance and soon to be championed by the one man whose approval truly mattered, Adolf Hitler. A messenger named Schmutt. The fallout from the Mechelin incident sent shockwaves through the Third Reich's military leadership. For General Halder and the OKH, it was a professional humiliation and a logistical nightmare. For Adolf Hitler, it was something more, an opportunity. From my archival research, it is clear that Hitler had always been privately lukewarm about the original Fall Gelb. Its pedestrian nature, its echo of 1914, and its promise of a costly, grinding attritional battle did not appeal to his gambler's instinct or his political need for a swift, stunning victory that would shatter Allied morale. He craved a masterstroke, not a slugging match. The compromise of the old plan gave him the justification he needed to discard it. In the weeks following the incident, Hitler became increasingly receptive to new, more radical ideas. This is where a key, often overlooked figure enters the narrative, Colonel Rudolf Schmutt, Hitler's chief Wehrmacht adjutant. Schmutt was not a strategist, but he was a loyal and perceptive aide with an intimate understanding of his master's psyche. He was one of the few who had seen Manstein's memoranda and, unlike the OKH traditionalists, he had recognized its intrinsic appeal to the Führer. Schmutt understood that Manstein's vision, a high-risk, high-reward thrust that relied on speed, surprise, and psychological shock, was perfectly aligned with Hitler's own operational inclinations. Acting as a quiet facilitator, Schmutt began to orchestrate the circumstances that would bring the exiled general and the Führer face to face. On February 13, 1940, Schmundt informed Manstein of a luncheon and introductory meeting for newly appointed corps commanders to be held with Hitler at the Reich Chancellery in 4 days' time. It was presented as a formality, a courtesy. But both men understood the potential significance. This was not an accident, it was a calculated move by an adjutant who knew precisely what his leader wanted to hear. The stage was being set for one of the most consequential military briefings of the 20th century. The briefing at the Chancellery. On February 17, 1940, Lieutenant General Erich von Manstein arrived at the imposing new Reich Chancellery in Berlin. He was one of several newly appointed commanders, and the atmosphere was one of stilted formality. He was, by design, the last general to be presented. As lunch concluded, Hitler moved down the line, engaging each general in brief, perfunctory conversation. When he reached Manstein, he asked him what he thought of the plan for the Western offensive. This was the moment. Drawing on the full force of his intellect and conviction, Manstein did not offer polite platitudes. He launched into a concise but devastating critique of the compromised OKH plan, outlining how it would lead to a head-on collision and indecisive slaughter. Then, he pivoted, laying out his own vision. Unfolding a map he had brought, his hands traced the audacious path, the concentration of armor, the drive through the impassable Ardennes, the crossing of the Meuse between Sedan and Dinant, and the decisive westward dash to the sea. The archival accounts of this meeting, drawn from the diaries of Alfred Jodl and others present, paint a remarkable picture. As Manstein spoke, Hitler, who had at first been listening with polite detachment, became intensely focused. He leaned over the map, his questions becoming sharper, more specific. He immediately grasped the strategic geometry of the plan. This was not a general's tedious plan, this was an artist's brushstroke across the canvas of Europe. Manstein explained how the thrust would not just engage the enemy but paralyze them, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and the best French armies from their supplies and from France itself. It targeted not the enemy's body, but its brain and nervous system. For nearly an hour, the two men were locked in intense dialogue, the other generals fading into the background. It was a meeting of minds, the cold, analytical Prussian strategist and the intuitive, high-stakes Austrian gambler. When Manstein finished, Hitler stood up, a look of excitement on his face. He had found his masterstroke. An audacious operation, the Führer is convinced. "You are the first one who has correctly understood my line of thought," Hitler declared to Manstein, a statement captured in post-war testimony. His enthusiasm was immediate and absolute. He turned to his aides, Jodl and Schmundt, and proclaimed, "This is a most audacious operation. It has the prospect of a great success." Why was Hitler so instantly and completely won over by a plan his own army high command had repeatedly rejected? The answer lies in a deep analysis of Hitler's personality and strategic outlook. Firstly, the plan appealed to his profound contempt for the professional officer corps, whom he often viewed as overly cautious, unimaginative, and fixated on outdated dogma. Manstein, in defying the OKH, appeared as a fellow rebel. Secondly, it was a plan built on will, surprise, and risk, concepts central to Hitler's own quasi-mystical belief in the power of willpower, will, to overcome material disadvantages. He saw it as a triumph of National Socialist dynamism over plotting democratic caution. Thirdly, and most pragmatically, Hitler understood the economic realities. Germany could not sustain a long war of attrition. The British naval blockade was a slow strangulation, and the Reich lacked the vast resources of the British and French empires. A quick, decisive victory, a Blitzkrieg, was an economic necessity, and the Sickle Cut was the only plan on the table that offered the possibility of such a victory within weeks, not years. That very afternoon, Hitler sent for Generals Brauchitsch and Halder. He did not ask their opinion. He informed them that the entire operational concept for Fall Gelb was to be fundamentally changed. The main effort would now be through the Ardennes. Manstein's vision, filtered through Hitler's will, was now official policy. He had not just approved the plan, he had seized it, made it his own, and would henceforth present it as a product of his own genius. The Fury of Zossen. The news landed like a bombshell at the OKH headquarters in the Zossen pine forests outside Berlin. General Franz Halder was apoplectic. His meticulous diary, a treasure of the German military archives, becomes a torrent of barely concealed fury and professional indignation. On February 18th, he wrote of a most unpleasant day where he was forced to accept a new plan based on the ideas of the clever Manstein, a man he had just exiled. To Halder, this was a complete breakdown of military discipline and process. The Führer, a dilettante, had gone over the heads of his senior commanders and listened to a subordinate. It was an insult to the entire institution of the General Staff. But an order was an order. With grim professionalism, Halder and his staff set to work. The task before them was monumental. It required nothing less than turning the entire German invasion force on its axis. The Schwerpunkt now had to shift from Army Group B in the north to Army Group A in the south. This meant rerouting 7 of the Wehrmacht's 10 precious panzer divisions, along with their vast support echelons. It was a logistical Herculean feat. New railway schedules had to be drawn up. Entire armies had to be moved hundreds of kilometers. Massive fuel and ammunition dumps had to be secretly established in the sparsely populated Eifel region, the German gateway to the Ardennes. Engineers from the Todt organization worked frantically to widen roads, reinforce bridges, and carve new tracks through the forests to accommodate the unprecedented traffic of thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of trucks. All of this had to be done under the constant threat of Allied air reconnaissance, demanding a massive camouflage and deception effort. For Halder, it was a nightmare, but for the German war machine, it was a testament to its terrifying efficiency. The Sickle Cut was no longer a sketch on a map, it was becoming a logistical reality, forged in fury and steel. The steel spearhead assembles. By the first week of May 1940, the transformation was complete. Along the western frontier of Germany, opposite Luxembourg and southern Belgium, the greatest concentration of armored fighting vehicles the world had ever seen was gathered in secret. This was the razor's edge of the sickle. To lead this decisive thrust, a new headquarters was created, Panzer Group Kleist, commanded by General Ewald von Kleist. Under his command were 2 Panzer Corps, totaling 5 Panzer divisions and 3 motorized infantry divisions. The tip of the spear was 19 Panzer Corps, led by the man who had dreamed of this moment for 2 decades, Heinz Guderian. His corps alone numbered over 800 armored vehicles. Let's look at the technology assembled. While Allied propaganda would later portray an unstoppable force of superior German tanks, the reality on my archival spec sheets is more nuanced. The force included a large number of obsolete Panzer Is and TUS, useful only for reconnaissance and flank security. The workhorses were the Panzer III, designed for tank versus tank combat but armed with only a 37mm gun, and the Panzer IV, with its short-barreled 75mm gun designed for infantry support. Critically, the force was bulked out by hundreds of Czech-made Panzer 38 TS, which proved to be surprisingly reliable and effective vehicles. But their individual specifications were less important than their collective doctrine and command structure. Every tank had its radio. Every commander was imbued with Guderian's philosophy of speed, initiative, and relentless forward momentum. Opposing them, behind the tranquil Ardennes landscape, were 9 French and Belgian divisions, mostly second-rate reservists with inadequate anti-tank weaponry and almost no air support. Their commanders had been assured for months that no major armored attack could possibly come through these woods. As the final days of the Phoney War ticked away, an immense kinetic energy was coiled in the Eifel forests. Over 1,200 tanks, 40,000 other vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of men stood poised, engines waiting for the single code word that would unleash the storm. The sickle was forged, honed, and ready to swing. The Allied mindset, a fortress of complacency. To comprehend the stunning success of the Sickle Cut, we must first enter the mind of the Allied command structure, a place of cloistered silence and deeply ingrained assumptions. The supreme commander of the French army, General Maurice Gamelin, directed the most powerful land army in the world not from a bustling forward headquarters, but from the quiet, almost monastic confines of the Château de Vincennes, east of Paris. His command post had no radio links to his armies in the field. Communication was deliberately slow, conducted via telephone and motorcycle dispatch rider, to prevent hasty, ill-considered decisions. It was a system designed to fight the last war, a war of timetables and methodical buildups. The central pillar of Gamelin's strategy was the Dilbreda plan. Upon any German invasion of the Low Countries, the finest units of the French army and the entirety of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, would pivot north, advancing to a new defensive line along the Dil River in Belgium. It was a logical, predictable, and thoroughly defensive maneuver. This plan rested on one monumental, fatal assumption: the impassability of the Ardennes. From my desk, I can pull the French General Staff's own assessment from 1938, a document that oozes doctrinal certainty. It describes the Ardennes as impenetrable for large units, a region of dense woods, deep valleys, and insufficient road networks that would, at best, allow for small infiltration units that could be easily contained. The French saw the forest as their greatest ally, a natural extension of the Maginot Line. Consequently, the crucial 60-mile sector of the front opposite the Ardennes, along the Meuse River, was entrusted to their weakest formations, the 2nd and 9th Armies, composed mainly of older reservists with inferior equipment and morale. They believed any German units emerging from the woods would be battered, disorganized, and weeks behind schedule. The Dil plan was therefore not just a strategy, it was a self-laid trap. By willingly sending their best, most mobile forces north into the Belgian plain, the Allies were doing exactly what Manstein's plan predicted and required. They were lunging at the Matador's Cape, leaving their flank wide open for the sword thrust to come. The mindset was not one of negligence, but of a profound, institutionally reinforced intellectual failure to imagine a new kind of war. May 10, 1940, the storm breaks. In the pre-dawn darkness of May 10, 1940, the Phoney War ended in a cataclysm of coordinated violence. The German offensive, finally unleashed, was a symphony of destruction played across multiple domains simultaneously. The opening notes were not played by tanks, but by silent gliders. In a feat of stunning precision and audacity, German airborne troops landed directly on top of the Belgian fortress of Ebene-Mael, the linchpin of the defenses guarding the Albert Canal. Using revolutionary hollow-charge explosives, they neutralized the fort's gun cupolas within minutes, paralyzing the very bastion designed to stop a German advance into Belgium. At the same time, Brandenburger commandos, dressed in Dutch military uniforms, seized key bridges over the Meuse and Juliana canals, holding them open for the advance of Army Group B. The Luftwaffe, in a series of devastating strikes, targeted 72 Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground and seizing control of the skies from the first hours. Under the cover of this chaos, the main event began. At 5:35, the immense armored columns of Army Group A lurched into motion, crossing the borders of Luxembourg and Belgium. The sheer scale of the movement was terrifying. Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps, Rommel's 7th Panzer Division, and the rest of Panzer Group Kleist poured into the narrow forest roads. The French and British high commands heard the news they had been expecting: Germany was invading the Low Countries. As anticipated, Gamelin gave the order to execute the Dil plan. The powerful French First Army and the BEF roared to life, their columns of tanks and trucks streaming north into Belgium, cheered on by relieved Belgian civilians. They were marching confidently into the greatest ambush in military history. Every mile they advanced north was another mile they were inserting their heads into the noose Manstein had prepared for them. The first, critical phase of the Sickle Cut had worked to perfection. The bait was taken. The Ardennes Passage, a traffic jam to victory. The journey through the Ardennes is often portrayed as a lightning dash, but the archival unit logs and personal diaries tell a different story. It was a monumental, barely controlled traffic jam. For nearly 3 days, the German armored spearhead was compressed into a handful of narrow, winding forest roads, creating a single column of vehicles that stretched back, nose to tail, for over 150 miles. This was the moment of maximum vulnerability for the entire operation. Thousands of tanks, armored cars, artillery pieces, and soft-skinned fuel trucks were packed together, crawling along at a snail's pace. A concerted Allied air attack on these choked roads could have been devastating, turning the Ardennes into a fiery scrapyard and stopping the invasion in its tracks. But the attack never came. The Luftwaffe's early strikes had disrupted the Allied air forces, and more importantly, Allied intelligence simply refused to believe what was happening. French reconnaissance pilots flew over the region and reported enormous, long columns of tanks, but their reports were dismissed by higher command as exaggerated or impossible. The fortress of complacency held firm. Down on the ground, it was a commander's nightmare. General von Kleist, a traditional cavalryman, was horrified by the chaos and the risk. He repeatedly ordered halts to allow the columns to decongest and the infantry to catch up. But his subordinate, Heinz Guderian, would have none of it. Consumed by a fanatical belief in forward momentum, Guderian was everywhere, driving up and down his column in a command car, personally directing traffic, bullying his officers, and relentlessly pushing them onward. He ignored Kleist's orders to halt, at one point famously shutting off his radio to avoid being told to stop. This insubordination was critical. Guderian understood something his superiors did not: speed was armor. Halting to regroup would give the French time to react, to reinforce the Meuse defenses. The only way to succeed was to crash through the forest and across the river before the enemy even realized what was happening. This wasn't a methodical advance, it was a high-speed gamble, fueled by gasoline, caffeine, and the sheer willpower of its commanders. The Meuse crossing, the hammer blow at Sedan. On the afternoon of May 12th, the lead elements of Guderian's 19 Panzer Corps emerged from the Ardennes forests and gazed upon their first true objective, the Meuse River at the historic French city of Sedan. This was the decisive point. A failure to cross the river swiftly would doom the entire plan. The defenders, from the French 55th and 71st Infantry Divisions, were reservists. They were men in their 30s and 40s, many of whom had fought in the trenches of 1916. They were brave, but they were about to face a form of warfare for which their experience had no frame of reference. On May 13th, the German assault began. It was not preceded by a lengthy artillery barrage as in the First World War. Instead, the Germans unleashed a new kind of artillery, the Luftwaffe. For hours, wave after wave of Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers descended upon the French positions. The psychological effect of the Stukas was even more devastating than their physical destruction. The terrifying, soul-shattering shriek of their Jericho trumpet sirens, combined with the explosions and the constant fear of being the next target, broke the nerve of the French defenders. Many units simply disintegrated, the men fleeing their bunkers in terror. Under the cover of this aerial onslaught, German combat engineers, pioneer, sprang into action. They did not wait for heavy pontoon bridges. In small inflatable assault boats, they paddled across the wide Meuse under sporadic but intense machine gun fire. They established a small, precarious bridgehead on the western bank. It was here that Guderian's doctrine of combined arms and delegated command proved its worth. As soon as a foothold was gained, tanks, anti-tank guns, and infantry were ferried across on larger rafts. By nightfall on May 13th, against all French expectations, the Germans had a solid bridgehead west of the Meuse. They had crossed the river and breached France's main line of resistance not in weeks, as Gamelin's staff had predicted, but in a single afternoon. The hinge of the entire Allied front had been shattered. The path to the sea lay open. The collapse of command. The news of the Meuse crossing, and specifically the breakthrough at Sedan, did not travel up the French chain of command as a clear report, but as a series of fragmented, panicked, and often contradictory messages. At his serene headquarters in Vincennes, General Gamelin and his staff could not process the information. Their maps, updated once or twice a day, could not keep pace with a battle being measured in hours and miles of penetration. They saw a bulge, a local crisis to be contained with counterattacks. They fundamentally failed to grasp that this was not a bulge, but a breakthrough. They had no strategic reserve. The Dill plan had committed their only mobile forces far to the north. On the evening of May 13th, the commander of the French Second Army, General Charles Hunsiger, worried about the breach, made a fatal decision. Instead of ordering his armored divisions to strike west to hit the flank of the German penetration, he ordered them east to protect the flank of the Maginot Line, still believing the main threat lay there. It was a catastrophic misreading of the situation. The intellectual paralysis was most famously captured in a phone call on May 15th. A panicked French Prime Minister, Paul Reynaud, telephoned the newly appointed British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and cried in English, "We have been defeated, we are beaten, we have lost the battle." A stunned Churchill, unable to believe it, flew to Paris the next day. At the Quai d'Orsay, he asked General Gamelin where the strategic reserve was, the masse de maneuver intended to counter any unforeseen enemy breakthrough. He spread his hands on the map, indicating the massive German panzer column now driving deep into France. Gamelin, in a moment of devastating honesty, simply shrugged and replied, "Aucune." None. In that one word, the bankruptcy of 20 years of French military doctrine was laid bare. There was no plan for this. The enemy was not playing by the rules. The German panzers were not consolidating their gains or waiting for infantry. They were racing west, into an operational vacuum, unhinging the entire Allied army. The sickle was not just cutting, it was disemboweling. Guderian's ride, the breakout. With the Meuse River behind him, Heinz Guderian faced a choice. Conventional military wisdom, and indeed the explicit orders from his superior, von Kleist, dictated that he should halt. He was to consolidate the bridgehead, widen it, and wait for the slow-moving infantry divisions to arrive and secure his flanks before proceeding. For Guderian, this was heresy. He understood that he possessed a fleeting, priceless advantage. The enemy's command structure was in a state of shock-induced paralysis. To stop now would be to forfeit the initiative and allow the French time to recover, to form a new defensive line, to bring their superior heavy tanks to bear on his exposed flanks. On the morning of May 14th, Guderian made a decision that sealed the fate of the campaign. In direct violation of his orders, he ordered his panzer divisions to pivot west and begin the dash for the English Channel. It was an act of breathtaking insubordination. When von Kleist learned of it, he flew to Guderian's headquarters in a rage, confronted him, and summarily relieved him of command for his disobedience. It took the intervention of Colonel General Wilhelm List, commander of the 12th Army, to broker a compromise. Guderian was reinstated, but was only permitted to conduct a reconnaissance in force and was not to advance his headquarters. Guderian brilliantly exploited this semantic loophole. He left a radio team at his current headquarters to maintain the fiction of his presence, while he personally joined his leading panzer units and continued to drive them relentlessly westward. This Guderian's ride became the stuff of legend. His columns, often led by the 1st Panzer Division, advanced at an astonishing pace, covering up to 50 miles a day, slicing through the flimsy French rear echelon troops who were utterly unprepared for combat. They captured towns, overran supply dumps, and spread panic, creating a psychological tidal wave far in advance of their steel tracks. The French command system, still trying to plot his position from the day before, found his spearheads were already 100 kilometers further west than they believed possible. Rommel's Ghost Division. While Guderian's corps formed the southern pincer of the breakthrough, another commander to his north was carving his own path of glory, Major General Erwin Rommel. His 7th Panzer Division, part of the 15 Panzer Corps, had also crossed the Meuse near Dinant. Like Guderian, Rommel was an embodiment of the new warfare, leading from the very front, often far ahead of his own main body. His personal leadership style was electric. He commanded not from a distant chateau but from his command tank or a light Fieseler Storch reconnaissance plane, constantly assessing the situation, identifying weaknesses, and driving his men forward. His division moved so fast and so often changed direction that it frequently disappeared from the maps of both friend and foe, earning it the nickname the Gespenster Division, the Ghost Division. The archival records of the 7th Panzer Division are a testament to this incredible speed and flexibility. Rommel did not fight set-piece battles. He bypassed strongpoints and attacked weak ones, accepting local surrenders and moving on before the enemy could organize a coherent defense. His advance was a classic example of exploiting the loop of observation, orientation, decision, and action, OODA loop, a concept that would be formalized decades later. He was making decisions and acting on them faster than his French opponents could possibly observe and orient themselves to the threat. On May 15, near Flavian, Rommel's division had a sharp encounter with the French 1st Armored Division. Here, the technological balance was put to the test. The French Char B-1 bis tanks were superior to Rommel's panzers in armor and firepower. But the French attack was poorly coordinated, their tanks lacked radios for tactical control, and they were critically short on fuel. Rommel, using his superior command and control and aggressive combined arms tactics, defeated the French force, not by outslugging them, but by outmaneuvering and outthinking them. This victory demonstrated that in Blitzkrieg, doctrine, speed, and communication were more decisive than the raw technical specifications of the tanks themselves. The channel reached, the Sickle closes. By May 19, the operational situation for the Allies was catastrophic. The map on the wall of the German High Command showed a deep, narrow corridor, the Panzerkiel or armored wedge, stretching from the Ardennes almost to the coast. The BEF, the Belgian army, and the 3 best French armies were now trapped in a pocket in Belgium and northern France, their supply lines from the south completely severed. Their only source of resupply was the English Channel. On May 20, just 10 days after the offensive began, lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, part of Guderian's corps, reached the coast at Noël-sur-Mer, near the mouth of the Somme River. A German officer, Lieutenant Ernst Joachim Zeck, filled a water bottle with channel water to send back to Berlin as proof. The Sickle Cut was complete. Manstein's audacious strategic vision had been realized with a speed and decisiveness that stunned the world, including the Germans themselves. In 10 days, they had achieved what their fathers had failed to achieve in 4 years of bloody slaughter from 1914 to 1918. The German armored spearheads now turned north, driving up the coast to seize the vital channel ports of Boulogne, Calais, and Dunkirk, aiming to tighten the noose and prevent any possibility of escape for the hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers trapped in the pocket. The economic and home front context here is critical. For Britain, the potential loss of its entire professional army, the BEF, was an existential threat. The United Kingdom had no large conscript army to replace it. The loss of the BEF would have left the British Isles virtually defenseless and could have forced Churchill's government to sue for peace. The fate of the war now hung on the fate of the men trapped in the shrinking pocket. The Arras counterstroke and the halt order. As the German panzers raced up the coast, the Allies made one last, desperate attempt to break the corridor. On May 21, a hastily assembled British force, codenamed Frankforce, launched a counterattack from the south near the town of Arras. The force consisted of only 2 infantry battalions and 74 tanks, most of which were heavily armored but mechanically unreliable Matilda Mki and Mk2 models. Though small, the attack struck the flank of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division and the SS Totenkopf Division. The British Matilda II tanks, with their thick armor, proved impervious to the standard German 37mm anti-tank guns. For a few terrifying hours, the Germans were thrown into panic. Rommel himself wrote of the very heavy fighting and the great losses inflicted by these powerful enemy tanks. The attack was only halted when Rommel, with his characteristic improvisation, brought up his division's 88mm anti-aircraft guns and used them in a direct-fire role. The high-velocity 88 was one of the few weapons capable of piercing the Matilda's armor, and it tore the British tanks apart. Though the Arras counterattack was ultimately repulsed, its psychological impact on the German command was immense. Generals von Kleist and von Rundstedt, already nervous about the speed of the advance and the vulnerability of their flanks, saw Arras as proof that their fears were justified. The panzers were overextended, their infantry support was lagging far behind, and the British were still capable of mounting powerful local attacks. This nervousness culminated in the single most controversial decision of the campaign. On May 24, with Guderian's tanks on the outskirts of Dunkirk and the BEF's last escape route about to be slammed shut, an order came down from Rundstedt's Army Group A headquarters, an order confirmed and approved by Hitler himself. The panzers were to halt. The miracle of Dunkirk, a failure of annihilation. The halt order of May 24 remains one of the most intensely debated subjects of the war. Why did the Germans stop when total annihilation was within their grasp? The archival evidence points to a confluence of factors, not a single cause. First, there was the genuine operational concern of Rundstedt and other commanders, amplified by the shock of Arras. They wanted to preserve their armor for the second phase of the campaign, the conquest of the rest of France, Fall Rot, and feared getting bogged down in costly urban and marshland fighting around Dunkirk. Second, there was the vanity of Hermann Göring, the commander of the Luftwaffe. He boasted to Hitler that his air force alone could prevent the evacuation and annihilate the trapped armies on the beaches, promising a victory for his branch of the Wehrmacht. Hitler, who had a high regard for air power and wanted to reward his loyal paladin, agreed. Third, and perhaps most speculatively, some historians argue that Hitler had a political motive. He may have believed that allowing the British army to escape would make them more amenable to a negotiated peace, seeing it as a magnanimous gesture to a fellow Germanic people. Whatever the precise combination of reasons, the effect was immediate and profound. The three-day halt gave the beleaguered BEF and their French allies a critical window of breathing space. It allowed them to form a solid defensive perimeter around the port and beaches of Dunkirk and, most importantly, it gave the British Admiralty time to initiate Operation Dynamo. This was the improvised mass evacuation, an armada of over 800 vessels, from Royal Navy destroyers to the famous little ships of civilian yachts, fishing boats, and ferries, that descended upon Dunkirk. The Luftwaffe, hampered by poor weather and the heroic resistance of the RAF's fighter command operating from bases in England, failed to deliver on Göring's promise. When the panzers were finally ordered to advance again on May 26, the perimeter was strong, and the evacuation was in full swing. By the time Dunkirk fell on June 4, 338,226 Allied soldiers, including over 120,000 French troops, had been rescued. Militarily, it was a colossal defeat. But morally, it was a miracle of deliverance that galvanized British resolve to fight on. The Sickle Cut had been a strategic masterpiece, but its final, killing blow had been stayed, leaving the enemy's heart, its will to resist, still beating.